what they're trying to do right now is just throw bodies, frankly, at the Ukrainian front. And I just don't see that as being a sustainable way to win. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, while unfortunately they have to wait, they are going to get weaponry that can actually help them take the offensive and retake territory. Well, obviously they're looking at intelligence, but they're also listening to what the Russians are saying and doing, and the Russians have been signaling that they're going to take an offensive, whether that's next week or, in 3 weeks. We don't really know exactly. I'm not sure that the Ukrainian intelligence is that precise, but certainly it's coming, and it's coming probably sooner rather than later.
Yeah, Alexei Reznikov is saying that Moscow's mobilized around 500,000 troops for the offensive. I mean, in the United States, Western intelligence, do they see evidence of that?
Well, I haven't seen the number 500,000, but certainly all the troops that President Putin called up a couple of months ago that he announced, I guess it was about 300,000. Those troops could be potentially here in the mix. It's a bit unclear how many have already been put into the fight and how many might be coming. The other issue is not just a question of the number of men, it's, do they have equipment? What are they going to be equipped with? Do they have weapons? Do they have protective gear? All of these things have been in short supply, along with training to use the equipment in Russia and among the Russian troops. So I think there are a lot of open questions, which is not to say that we should be relaxed or that the Ukrainians should be relaxed either, but there are still a lot of open questions about the Russian capability.
Yeah, I mean, we've had something of a stalemate in the conflict, haven't we, in recent months? But do you think there is really likely to be a renewed push from the Russians once the weather starts to ease a little?
I think so, Carol, because President Putin put General Gerasimov, his chief of the armed forces, essentially back in charge of this new invasion. I guess this new phase of the war, and he was in effect the architect of it. So that was a signal, and of course, again, the rhetoric coming out of Moscow indicates that something's going to happen. I think it's hard for them not to try, but what they're trying to do right now is just throw bodies, frankly, at the Ukrainian front, and I just don't see that as being a sustainable way to win. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, while unfortunately they have to wait, they are going to get weaponry that can actually help them take the offensive and retake territory. That is to say, more, well, first of all, tanks and armored vehicles, more artillery and ammunition, hopefully eventually longer range artillery, and hopefully eventually also fighter aircraft like the MiGs to start with.
Yeah, I mean, Alexei Reznikov seems to think that an attack could start as soon as the first anniversary of the original invasion on the 24th of February. Presumably, those tanks, which have now been pledged by the UK, other European nations, and the United States, I don't know if any of those would be ready by then, would they?
Right. I mean, most of the accounts that I've seen indicate that they would not likely be ready, nor would the Ukrainians be ready to use them, meaning would they be trained to use them. But hopefully they've been secretly training somewhere already, and maybe we can accelerate the process. It is critical to do something quickly to make sure that the Russians don't get an advantage. And the February 24th date is plausible because the Russians, they really do, I guess, hang their hats and their actions on historical, dates on the calendar.
Yes, and that would also be around the time of Russia's Defender of the Fatherland Day on the 23rd of February, which celebrates the army. Evelyn, you mentioned the possibility of fighter jets. Boris Johnson, Britain's former Prime Minister, is around in the United States calling for jets to be sent to Ukraine. President Biden at the moment is saying no. Do you think there is further pressure for jets to be sent to Ukraine?
Yes, I actually had the pleasure of meeting the former prime minister in a small group yesterday, and he was very much advocating for robust assistance to Ukraine. He even put an editorial in one of our major newspapers, the Washington Post. So he is one of many voices advocating for fighter jets. This is something that's been necessary for a while. Ukraine needs air cover. Ukraine needs to provide this shield for their troops. Of course, they also need different kinds of air support for the or air cover for the civilians. But the fighter aircraft do provide an ability for the Ukrainians to strike back against Russian aircraft, against Russian artillery and mortar positions, and certainly to defend their own troops.
And do you think there's any chance of President Biden changing his mind and agreeing to send them? Just briefly, if you could, Evelyn.
I do think so. And mostly I'll just say, Carol, we've seen a pattern. If the United States agrees to send some kind of weapon system, then that provides kind of the ability for allies in unison to provide the same kind of weapon system.